Normandy, June 6, 1944. The sea churns black beneath a sky trembling with flak and fire. The first wave of Allied infantry is moments from storming the blood-soaked beaches. German machine guns are locked in place. Their eyes wait behind bunkers. Death is ready. But then, rumbling through the chaos, comes something impossible. A tank, with no crew inside. It rolls straight into enemy fire, unflinching, unstoppable. The Germans don't know it yet, but they've just been outwitted by a man they never saw coming. Not a general, not a soldier, a British engineer once dismissed as mad for believing he could build a weapon that would go into battle without risking a single soul. This is the true story of Percy Hobart, the eccentric genius who defied logic, challenged fear, and designed the tank that changed D-Day forever. Percy Hobart was never supposed to change history. In fact, by the time the world went to war, the British Army had already thrown him away. A career officer turned engineer, Hobart's mind burned with unconventional ideas, too unconventional for his own good. While others dreamed of metals and strategies, he obsessed over blueprints, armor thickness, and the terrifying geometry of tank treads. He wasn't the kind of man to command battalions with speeches. He commanded from the silence of his workbench, from midnight hours spent sketching machines no one believed in. When he proposed a radical idea, armored vehicles that could breach beaches, cross craters, and even fight without a crew, his superiors scoffed. They called him unrealistic, paranoid, even dangerous. In 1940, they forced him into early retirement. It should have ended there. But Britain was at war, and the old ways were failing. As the Nazis swept across Europe with lightning speed, crushing nations under the weight of their blitzkrieg, the Allies realized they needed more than courage and tradition. They needed invention. In desperation, Churchill called back his disgraced engineer, not to lead men, but to build machines. He gave Hobart a blank slate and one terrifying mission: prepare for an amphibious invasion unlike any in history. The beaches of France would be fortified, trapped, mined. To land there without a miracle would mean slaughter. Churchill needed a madman bold enough to think beyond bullets, and Hobart was ready. The war had changed, and so had he. Driven not by pride but purpose, Hobart returned with a fury. He was older, his hair grayer, his body stale from years of disappointment. But inside him still burned that obsessive light, the belief that machines, if designed right, could do what men could not. He began to design a family of tanks so radical they barely seemed real. Tanks that could swim, tanks that could crush wire, lay bridges, explode mines. And most of all, tanks that didn't need a human crew inside. What he imagined sounded insane. But so did the war. In the darkness of his workshop, he scribbled the first drafts of what would become the most unorthodox invention of the Allied invasion. A remotely operated tank, a steel beast controlled from afar, sent into battle not to protect life, but to replace it. Hobart wasn't trying to win glory. He was trying to prevent mass death. But his superiors weren't so sure. Even with Churchill's support, many in the military saw him as a relic, an eccentric, an embarrassment. His designs were ridiculed, his blueprints buried in red tape. No man, they whispered, should tamper with the soul of warfare like this. Yet Hobart refused to back down. He remembered the trenches of the First World War, the bodies, the senseless charges into wire and flame. This time, he vowed, machines would take the first bullets, not boys. And so he worked, obsessively. He stripped down existing tanks, rebuilt them from the inside out, installed early radio controls, primitive, glitchy, but groundbreaking. These tanks would be sacrificed, not soldiers. They would roll ahead of the infantry, triggering mines, drawing fire, and marking safe paths forward. He called them Hobart's funnies. His enemies called them madness. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied troops surged toward the cliffs of Normandy, these so-called absurdities would prove anything but. They would become the steel vanguard of freedom. And Hobart, the rejected engineer, would become the ghost in the machine that changed the war. The wind howled off the channel, thick with salt and smoke. Allied destroyers pounded the coast, their shells crashing into German bunkers in deafening rhythms. It was the early hours of D-Day, June 6, 1944, the beginning of Operation Overlord. The greatest amphibious invasion in human history was underway. Over 156,000 Allied troops were about to hit the beaches of Normandy. But long before most boots touched the sand, something else arrived first. Rolling, clanking, unstoppable. The machines of a man once discarded by his own army. Percy Hobart's so-called funnies had been loaded aboard modified landing craft, their engines silent beneath the roar of artillery. Inside, no crew sat waiting. No hearts beat with fear. These were not ordinary tanks. They were the products of obsession, forged from humiliation and genius, driven by a singular goal. Let metal die before men. As the landing craft's ramps crashed open and water rushed in, Hobart's creations surged forward. Sherman tanks altered almost beyond recognition. Some swam, literally. They floated on inflated canvas screens, spinning twin propellers to crawl towards shore through icy waters. These were the duplex drive tanks, DDS, built with one purpose: lead the charge across open beaches, draw fire and break through defenses before the infantry arrived. But the sea did not care about invention. Waves towered higher than expected, and currents churned with fury. Some DD tanks sank before reaching land, swallowed in seconds. Inside those that carried crews, soldiers drowned silently, trapped in armor that became their tomb. But the remotely operated units, the ones Hobart had fought hardest for, pressed forward without hesitation or human cost. Controlled from a distance by operators hidden in safer craft offshore, they became ghost machines, silent and expressionless, braving fire and shrapnel that would have torn living men apart. German defenders were stunned. From their concrete bunkers and machine gun nests, they expected waves of screaming men. Instead, they saw tanks emerging from the surf like specters, unflinching, unnatural. Some fired shells, others spewed flame. Still others dragged massive steel chains that whipped through the sand to detonate hidden mines. These were the flail tanks, one of Hobart's most controversial inventions. Massive armored vehicles rigged with rotating chains to trigger explosives in their path. The Germans had prepared their beach defenses for infantry, rows of barbed wire, anti-personnel mines, anti-tank walls, but they were not prepared for these monsters of engineering. As the flail tanks cleared paths through the deadly fields, engineers and infantry followed behind them, alive only because someone else had gone first. Not a person, a machine. Elsewhere, another Hobart design roared ashore, the AVRE, or Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers. Equipped with a monstrous mortar known as the Petard Spigot, it could demolish bunkers in a single blast. These tanks had been mocked in planning rooms. Why would anyone fire a giant short-range shell that looked more like plumbing than a weapon? But on D-Day, the answer was clear. German fortifications that would have taken dozens of lives to clear with grenades and flame were erased in seconds. One AVRE destroyed a fortified gun position that had stalled a beach advance for over an hour. The gun crew never saw it coming. Behind the smoke screens and steel, the infantry finally landed. Thousands of young men, some barely out of school, stormed the beaches of Gold, Juno, and Sword. They ran past burning vehicles and bodies. But they also ran behind cleared lanes, past diffused mines, past shredded wire, lanes created by machines that had taken the first wave of hell. Hobart's machines. His gamble had worked. Where traditional tanks would have been slaughtered, his modified, often unmanned designs paved the way. But it hadn't been easy. Even in the final hours before launch, senior commanders had hesitated. American forces at Omaha Beach rejected many of Hobart's inventions. They feared the equipment was too experimental, too unreliable. They would pay the price for that decision. Without flail tanks and mine clearers, the first waves at Omaha were cut down in horrifying numbers. The sand turned red. Lives were lost that might have been spared. It was a brutal vindication of Hobart's vision, a vision fueled by memory, guilt, and an unrelenting will to prove that machines should bleed before men. For Hobart, though, this was never about revenge against those who doubted him. It was about conviction. He remembered the First World War all too well. He had seen friends torn apart by machine guns, boys sent over the top into certain death. He had seen the price of tradition. Now, with these machines lumbering across enemy soil, he had given the next generation something else, a chance to live. Long before Percy Hobart's machines rumbled ashore on Normandy, before steel ghosts rolled into the maw of German fire, there was a man, utterly alone, not in the trenches or under artillery, but exiled in his own country. Years before D-Day, Hobart had been cast out of the very institution he had devoted his life to serving. After decades in the British Army, where he rose through the ranks as a fierce advocate for armored warfare, Hobart was dismissed in disgrace. Why? Because he thought too far ahead, because he spoke too loudly, because he saw a future in tanks when most still believed in horses and trenches. In 1939, the British military still clung to outdated strategies and rigid doctrines. The senior brass saw Hobart's ideas as disruptive, even dangerous. They feared his vision more than they feared Germany's growing threat. So they retired him, quietly, coldly, without honor. It was a personal death sentence for a man like Hobart. He had no fortune, no connections to fall back on. All he had were his ideas, and the fury that came with watching Europe slide toward war while the country ignored its most radical minds. He was humiliated, angry, and heartbroken, but he did not stop thinking. In the small Welsh town of Chipping-Campden, he took refuge. While Britain prepared for war, Hobart built a makeshift laboratory in his garden shed. There, among the hum of tools and smell of oil, he scribbled designs for vehicles that didn't yet exist. Some nights he would work until dawn, his hands shaking from fatigue and the cold, driven by the haunting thought that young men would soon die by the thousands. And he could have done something to prevent it. The world had labeled him mad. But madness, Hobart believed, was just a word for vision in the eyes of cowards. Then something unexpected happened. Winston Churchill, recently appointed prime minister and desperate for bold ideas, remembered Hobart. Churchill had a notorious hatred for complacency and a deep respect for unconventional minds. When he learned that the army had sacked one of its most inventive officers, he erupted in fury. "Why is this man not in uniform?" he demanded. Within weeks, Hobart was reinstated. Not quietly, but with a storm. He was given command of a special armored unit, the 79th Armored Division. But there was a twist. This wasn't a fighting force. Not yet. It was a workshop, an experimental forge for dreams. Churchill wanted results, not protocol. Hobart was free to design, to build, to innovate. What followed was one of the most extraordinary periods of military invention in modern history. Hobart's mind, finally unleashed, became a storm of sketches, calculations, and prototypes. He surrounded himself with fellow misfits, engineers, tank crews, welders, and mechanics who had been cast aside by the conventional war machine. They worked in hangars, garages, and open fields, welding dreams into steel. Some days they watched their inventions explode during testing. Other days, they watched the impossible crawl to life. The pressure was suffocating. D-Day was approaching fast. Hobart knew what awaited the soldiers who would be asked to land first. Rows of steel obstacles, mines buried in every square meter, machine guns zeroed to crossfire the open sand. Every second of delay would cost dozens of lives. There was no room for failure. Each prototype had to serve a deadly purpose. Nothing decorative, nothing theoretical. Every bolt, gear, and control had to work in chaos, soaked in seawater, under fire. That's when Hobart proposed something so radical, even his closest allies hesitated. What if some tanks didn't need men inside them? It was a concept born from grief. Hobart knew the toll of war intimately. His younger brother, a brilliant Royal Navy officer, had been killed in the First World War. Friends had vanished into trenches. He had buried men he trained. He could not bear the thought of the next generation suffering the same fate. If a machine could take a bullet, then it should. That was his guiding belief. Not glory, not conquest, just one simple moral principle. Machines exist to protect life, not replace it, not control it, but protect it. Every pound of armor was worth it if it meant one less mother received a telegram of death. So he designed the first operationally deployed radio-controlled tanks. Primitive by modern standards, yes, but revolutionary in concept. Operators could guide these tanks from a distance, using early wireless signals. They could be sent straight into danger, over minefields, into nests of barbed wire, toward pillboxes, without risking a human crew. Some models could even be fitted with explosive payloads to be driven directly into enemy fortifications. They weren't perfect. The signal was weak. Interference was common. Sometimes they lost control, but when they worked, they were unstoppable, and they were terrifying. Even Allied commanders were unnerved. Dawn broke over the English Channel like a firestorm. The date was June 6, 1944, D-Day, and the invasion was underway. But history doesn't move in straight lines. It lurches, falters, stumbles through chaos. And for a terrifying moment, Percy Hobart's masterstroke, the culmination of years of exile, design, and obsession, stood on the brink of failure. The waters off Normandy churned not just with waves, but with fear. German artillery pounded the surf. Screaming metal tore through the morning mist. Soldiers crouched behind thin walls of steel, praying the beach wouldn't become their grave. And amid this hell, the strange shapes of Hobart's funnies emerged. Shermans wrapped in canvas skirts, tanks that looked like floating bathtubs, contraptions bristling with chains, spigots, and flame. To most, they seemed alien. To the Allied High Command, they were the gamble that might save the invasion, or doom it entirely. From the very start, things went wrong. The seas, restless and unpredictable, rose higher than expected. Swells battered the landing craft. Several duplex-drive DD tanks, meant to swim ashore using inflatable screens, were launched too far from the coast. Their propellers churned desperately, but the water overwhelmed them. One by one they sank. Crews trapped inside were dragged down into the cold, dark silence. In some sectors, particularly Omaha Beach, nearly all the DD tanks went under before they could reach land. Without armored support, the infantry was left exposed. On the sand, bullets ripped into them without mercy. The beach turned red. To Hobart, listening from a forward command post, the reports were like knives to the chest. His inventions, so carefully crafted, so rigorously tested, were supposed to save lives, not disappear beneath the waves. In that moment, doubt surged inside him like a storm. Had he asked too much of these machines? Had his ideas, once called mad, proven just that? The weight of every lost tank and every drowned crewman pressed down on his chest like steel. All his life, he had fought for a new kind of warfare. But now, in the crucible of Normandy, that vision teetered. Yet not all was lost. On other beaches, Gold, Juno, Sword, the tide turned in Hobart's favor. There, the DD tanks had been launched closer to shore, and the sea was kinder. The tanks floated, barely, and then rumbled onto land like mythic beasts rising from the depths. The moment they hit sand, they went to work. Shells roared from their turrets, tearing into German bunkers. Machine guns rattled, silencing sniper nests. And more importantly, Hobart's specialized vehicles followed. Flail tanks, their spinning chains whipping the sand ahead of them, detonated mines in violent, rhythmic blasts. The ground heaved with each explosion, but the soldiers following in their tracks were spared. Then came the AVRES, Assault Vehicles Royal Engineers. Designed for siege, these beasts carried massive 290mm mortars that fired flying dustbins, short-range demolition bombs that obliterated pillboxes and fortified casemates. In one legendary moment, an AVRE pulled up just 30 meters from a German stronghold and fired point blank. The structure vanished in a single flash. Infantry that would have died storming that bunker now advanced unharmed. The impossible had been achieved, not by strategy alone, but by innovation. Still, there were moments when everything nearly collapsed. Some Hobart vehicles broke down under the strain. Their complex systems, built in haste, cracked under fire and overuse. On Sword Beach, one flail tank jammed and burst into flames. Its flail detonated prematurely, showering shrapnel in all directions. Yet another AVRE was hit before it could fire, its crew barely escaping the wreckage. Engineers on the beach scrambled to repair tracks while bullets flew past their heads. The machines were working, but just barely. They weren't perfect. They were desperate inventions born in desperate times. And then came the moment that defined the machines and their maker. A narrow breach had to be opened through a dense minefield at Juno Beach. Standard tanks couldn't cross. Infantry couldn't advance. Artillery had zero line of sight. The entire sector stalled. But Hobart's bridge-laying tanks were still operational. One creaked forward under heavy fire, inching toward the edge of the minefield. Its hydraulic arms extended, releasing a 30-foot trackway, literally building a road across death. Behind it, engineers with minesweepers followed. Then came the flails, clearing the next few meters. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they moved forward, until at last the breach was complete. Troops surged through. The sector was saved. What the world saw that day was not a flawless execution. It was not clean or easy or guaranteed. But it worked. Hobart's machines, strange, ugly, misunderstood, had done what no traditional unit could have. They had absorbed the shock. They had bled so others wouldn't.